welcome to my channel. My name is Erica, and today's video is episode 8 of a true crime series I'm doing here on my channel, True Crime in Oregon. I've always been very intrigued by true crime, and I am from the state of Oregon, so I thought it would be interesting to combine those two things. Now, this is the case of Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer. And he murdered 48 innocent women, primarily sex workers, in the Seattle, Washington area in the early 1980s. However, his crimes and the investigation went on for 20 years until he was finally captured. And he's suspected of murdering up to 71 victims. And I realize that these crimes did take place in the state of Washington, but a few of the victims were from the state of Oregon, and several of the victims' remains were found in Portland, Oregon. So I thought it would make sense to pull this case into this series. Now, all of the information I'm giving you in today's video came from this book right here, and this is Green River Running Red by Ann Rule. And I will say that I started reading this book in September in the hopes to create this video and put it up in the month of October. But I really was not prepared for how much detail is in this book. Ann Rule does such an incredible job of really detailing this case. Gary, his crimes, the investigation, and especially the victims and their lives. And that's very important to me. When I do these videos and I find a book to read to give you the information out of, it's really important for me that the author focuses a lot on the victims and their lives, like really gives voice to the victims. And Anne definitely did that in this book. Now, this does belong to my daughter, but there is a link to this book, I'm pretty sure, on Amazon. I did see that a while back on Amazon. And if that's still available, I will pop the link to this book in my description box. So if you're interested in finding out more information that I will be giving you in today's video, I highly recommend checking out this book. I will be giving you a lot of information, but I can't give it all to you or we'd be here for hours. But I do highly recommend, like I said, if you're interested in learning more about this case, picking up this book. Now, as with all of my true crime videos, I want to give a huge disclaimer here. Viewer discretion is absolutely advised. I will be detailing some very violent sexual crimes, so I would not have young viewers around while you're watching or listening to this video. So without any further ado, let's get into the case of Gary Ridgway, also known as the Green River Killer. Gary Leon Ridgway was born February 15th, 1949 in Salt Lake City, Utah, to Tom and Mary Ridgway, and he was the second oldest of 3 sons. His father worked as a bus driver, and his mother was employed at the department store JCPenney's. Now, his mother was described as a total perfectionist. She always had to look her best. Perfect outfits, perfect makeup, hair, jewelry, and she was also known to be a very domineering and very controlling wife and mother. Now, Gary was described as a strange child, very pale, very quiet, very sullen, very small. He really struggled in school and was never a good student, and reading and spelling were the most difficult subjects for him. And later in life, he was diagnosed as dyslexic. He was often picked on and bullied and teased, and it was not uncommon for him to come home from school when he was in grade school, covered in bruises and cuts from the beatings he would suffer from his classmates. Now, Gary was also a bedwetter, and this went on well into junior high school, and his mother would just become furious with him when he would wet the bed, and she would tell him how disgusting and filthy and how disappointing that he was. Now, Gary's mother would force him to allow her to bathe him when he would wet the bed, and this also went well into junior high school, way past the time when Gary was capable of bathing himself. And of course, this made him feel very embarrassed, very humiliated, and very ashamed of himself. Now, his parents moved around a lot as Gary was growing up, and so he never really felt like he could put down roots or form any real friendships. The minute he would start kind of developing relationships with his peers, his parents would then jerk him away and move him to another town. And of course, the bullying continued, which made him feel very powerless and very weak. And due to being isolated and moving around so much and not really gaining any true friendships in his life, he started to feel like something was very wrong with him. And he also felt like other people could see that there was something very wrong with him. Now, due to his poor academic performance, Gary was held back twice throughout his educational career. And that only compounded his feelings of embarrassment and humiliation and shame. He felt really awkward around his classmates because he was older than most of them. And as he continued to grow up, this shame and embarrassment turned to very deep sadness and also very deep-seated anger. And when he was in grade school, he began to lash out. He started setting fires around the neighborhood, mostly in people's like garages or small business outbuildings. And he actually lit an entire field on fire, but he was never caught. After he would set these fires, he would race home and hide in his basement for hours until he felt like it was safe to come out. So because he wasn't getting caught lighting these fires, that gave him a real sense of power and control. He also ended up vandalizing his elementary school. He took several rocks and threw those through several windows at his school. And his mother knew that something was off with him. She could just tell something wasn't exactly right. So she did have him see the school psychologist when he was in elementary school. They did try to hypnotize him, but nothing really came of that. Like, the psychologist didn't really delve into what exactly was going on in Gary's life. So he did see the psychologist a few times, and then that came to an end. As Gary entered into middle school, his parents moved to Seattle, Washington, where they finally settled and moved into a very nice middle-class neighborhood. He was entering into puberty, and as I mentioned, he was still wetting the bed. And his mother would continue to bathe him, like I said, well past the age that Gary could bathe himself. And as most adolescent boys do, he was starting to have sexual curiosities, sexual thoughts, and sexual feelings. And of course, he was never able to discuss these thoughts and feelings at home with his parents. That was strictly forbidden. But he noticed that his body was responding sexually when his mother would bathe his genitalia. And that made him feel extremely embarrassed, extremely disgusted with himself. And he also felt really betrayed by his own body. And he became very angry with his mother. So here's this teenage boy having these sexual thoughts and feelings and curiosities. He's also extremely angry with his mother, having this sexual response to the bathings that his mother is giving him. So that anger and his sexual thoughts and feelings kind of mixed in his mind, and his sexual fantasies became very violent at this time of his life. And his anger just continued to grow and grow. And he started at this point to lash out at others in a few ways. He started to hurt animals. The most common thing that he would do when he was in middle school is take his BB gun outside and shoot and kill birds. At one point, he even took one of the family's pet cats and put that in a picnic cooler. He shut and locked the lid down and left the cat in there for several hours. And later when he went back out, of course, the cat had suffocated to death. And that, again, gave him this overwhelming sense of power and control. And he felt this superior feeling to others. He also became a peeping Tom. Most often he was spying at girls in the locker room at the local swimming pool. And then in the evenings, he would ride around his neighborhood and he would get into people's yards and spy on young women through their bedroom windows. And he would also rub up against girls at school, surreptitiously feeling their bodies, especially their breasts. But because he was so withdrawn and so quiet and so unassuming looking, they didn't realize he was doing this on purpose. They thought he was doing it on accident. And one evening, as he was walking to one of his middle school dances, he came upon a 6-year-old boy that was playing in the street. And Gary grabbed hold of him and pulled him into the bushes, stabbing him in the back with a pocket knife that Gary was known to carry. Now, this punctured the boy's kidney, and fortunately, he made a full recovery. But unfortunately, he didn't even see Gary's face. He had no idea who had done this to him, so again, he did not get caught. And at one point, Gary actually convinced a young female cousin of his to go into the woods with him, where he molested her. Once again, not getting caught. Gary was also extremely obsessed with any kind of violent crime that was reported in the news, especially rape and murder of women. And he would commonly talk about these cases at length with his father. Now, because Gary had been held back twice, he was 20 years old when he graduated from high school. And he knew when he graduated that college was just not in the cards for him. He knew he was not a good enough student to be successful in college. So he did enlist in the Navy, and he was stationed initially in San Diego, California. And at this point, he met his first real girlfriend, and they did get married in August of 1970. However, their marriage was pretty problematic from the very beginning, and they didn't even stay married for an entire year. Gary was stationed all around the world with the Navy, and he started having sexual affairs with sex workers, at one point contracting gonorrhea from his sexual affairs with these sex workers. And when he finally came clean to his wife and let her know what was going on, she actually admitted to him that she also had been having affairs because Gary was just never around. So they decided to part ways. She stayed in San Diego and he moved back to Seattle, Washington, and their divorce was finalized. Now, not long after settling back in Seattle, Washington, he did meet another woman who would become his second wife and give birth to his only son. And he also took a job as a painter at the Kenworth Truck Company. And he would paint the semis and other rigs that that company is known for. Now, Gary's mother was still a very active part of his life. She would buy his clothes for him, even picking out the clothes that he wore every day. She would go grocery shopping for him. She would clean his house. She would pay his bills, balance his checkbook. And his wife did think that that was strange, but she got along with Mary okay. And Gary and Mary really did their best to try to make it look to the outside world that their relationship was perfectly normal. Now, Gary's co-workers described him as a nice guy, but in some cases, like almost too nice, like he would try too hard. And he would get pretty touchy-feely with female co-workers and had to be warned several times to leave them alone. But he was a dependable worker, and he actually ended up working at the Kenworth Truck Company for over 20 years. Now, his second wife described Gary as a definite sex addict. He would demand that they have sex multiple times a day. And he would also demand that they would have sex out of doors, like in semi-public places. And there were several occasions where Gary would try to choke her, pretty violently choke her while they were having sex. And she made it very clear to him that she was not okay with that behavior and asked him to stop. And even though he and his wife were having sex quite often, that was still not enough for Gary. And in the 80s, he started really soliciting the services of sex workers. And eventually in 1982, he was arrested for soliciting a sex worker. And it was really interesting because his friends and his family, his wife, just people around him, knew him to really despise sex work. I mean, he would talk about that quite often. He would say how evil sex workers were, that they were abominations, that they were the root of all evil in moral society. So when he was arrested, his wife just had enough. She was starting to suspect that he was lying to her. So she basically just sat Gary down and explained to him that she was no longer in love with him, that actually she had had an affair and had fallen in love with another man, and that she wanted a divorce. So they did split. Their divorce was finalized, and they did get along pretty well, like they were civil with each other, and they did a really good job of co-parenting their son together. But unbeknownst to anyone, Gary was beginning a very vicious, violent, horrendous criminal pattern that would take 20 years for him to be caught. And when he was finally caught, everyone that knew him found this absolutely unbelievable. On July 15th, 1982, the body of 16-year-old sex worker Wendy Lee Caulfield was found floating in the Green River. Now, the Green River is located in King County, Washington, which is close to the Pacific Highway South, commonly known as the Pack Highway by locals. And the Pack Highway was a very busy place in the 1980s. It was lined with restaurants, taverns, bars, motels, and hotels. And it was also very heavily populated with sex workers. Now, Wendy had been found raped, beaten, and strangled to death. And she was a beautiful, young, fresh-faced woman who was just getting her start in life. And she just really didn't want to be home and adhering to her family's rules. So she was just making her way in the world and felt that sex work would provide her with an income. And the unfortunate part of the investigation at this point is that there were no real suspects. Nobody really knew who any of her associates were, who her like regular Johns were. She'd just gotten into this lifestyle. And so they just didn't really even know where to begin to search for the person that had murdered her. And then on August 12th of 1982, the body of 23-year-old sex worker Deborah Lynn Bonner was also found floating in the Green River. And just like Wendy, she had been raped, beaten, and strangled to death. Now, Deborah had been on the streets a little bit longer than Wendy. She was a beautiful young woman, really fun to be around, and both Wendy and Deborah's families were absolutely devastated by their loss. And again, the police start investigating. They're not too sure that these two murders are linked because Deborah and Wendy, by all accounts, never even knew each other. But of course, they continued to investigate both murders. Now, 3 days later, on August 15th of 1982, a local man was putting a raft into the Green River when he noticed two more bodies floating just underneath the surface of the river. So of course, he goes and calls the police. And as the police arrive, a detective literally stumbled over a third body. So now there are three more bodies. all female, all have been beaten, raped, and strangled to death. The first body was identified as 31-year-old sex worker Marcia Faye Chapman, and she was the mother of 3 beautiful children that were the absolute light of her life. And she and her children were living in a hotel on the Pack Highway, and she was using sex work as a way to provide an income and to raise her children. And she was known as Tiny amongst her friends, and she had a ton of friends, and people just adored her. She was kind of known as the life of the party. The second body was identified as 17-year-old sex worker Cynthia Hines. Now, she was known as Cookie on the streets, and she too had tons of friends. People just adored her. And she had gotten hooked up with a pimp, and she was doing her best to try to cut ties with him and get away from him. And initially, he was investigated very seriously. They just had no evidence linking him to these murders. And finally, the third body was identified as 16-year-old Opal Charmaine Mills, and she was a new friend of Cynthia's. And she came from a loving yet very turbulent home, and she was just tired of living in that environment. So she had joined Cynthia, and they were out on the streets together quite often. And Opal had an older brother whose main job in life was to look out for her. And he was absolutely devastated over her loss and really blamed himself for her death for years to come. And all of these women had families and friends that absolutely adored them, and they were absolutely devastated by their losses. And one of the things that the medical examiner found with Marcia and with Cynthia is that the killer had placed triangular-shaped rocks in their vaginas. And so that was like seen as like a symbolic rape or like a rape after death. But they also started wondering if maybe this was like voodoo related or some kind of like ritualistic killing. And they also found semen and hair belonging to the killer. And so of course that evidence was collected and cataloged. So at this point, of course, there's no denying that a pattern is starting. And they're really trying to nail down what this pattern is. Is it because they are sex workers? Is there something more to it than that? Does this have anything to do with like a drug deal gone wrong? Is there an angry pimp, a network of angry pimps? So the investigation gets started and gets kicked into high gear. However, there were some things about the investigation or things about these victims that were kind of stumping them. First of all, the victims were multiracial, which with serial killing, typically a serial killer will murder victims of his own race. The ages span from 14 to the mid-30s of these victims. And there was really no known association amongst all of them. You know, there was a couple that did know each other, but they didn't all know each other. So they were just really trying to figure out exactly what was going on here. And as the investigation continued, sex workers that were working and living along the Pack Highway started to go missing. And of course, these women who were going missing, their family members were like in a frenzied panic and were just so desperate for these police officers to locate them and bring them home safely. And eventually the Green River Task Force was assembled. And this consisted of the best detectives in the area. And they even asked for the FBI's assistance. And at this point, John Douglas was a very well-known, very intelligent FBI agent. And he'd actually helped to coin the phrase serial killer. He had done a ton of research about serial killing, and so they really wanted his help. And they actually asked him to create a psychological profile about who he thought the killer could be. They were consulting psychics, and they were not leaving any stone unturned. They were doing multiple interviews with any known associate of the victims that had already been found and also of the missing women. And they just were not able to tie anyone to these murders. They did have a few suspects as time went on, but they just could never find enough evidence to conclusively prove that any of these suspects were involved in these murders and also these missing women. I mean, they even went to Oregon and Idaho because some of the victims that had gone missing on the Pack Highway were from Oregon and Idaho, and they still could not find anything that would really tie anyone to these crimes. Now, in the summer of 1983 is when victims' remains started to be found. And these remains were found in fields near the Seattle airport, by the roadside, and also in cemeteries. And they were calling these cluster dumps because there was anywhere from 8 to 10 victims' remains that were found. They were all skeletonized and really not a whole lot of evidence. And most of the victims were identified through their dental records. I mean, in some cases, the skeletonized remains were found like right next to the road. It was almost like the killer was taunting the police, like trying to prove that they couldn't find him and that he was going to continue to get away with this. And then in 1984, remains of these victims were actually found in Portland, Oregon. So of course the Green River Task Force went and investigated in Portland, but just could not find enough evidence to tie anyone again to these crimes. Then in 1985, the Green River Task Force received a very misspelled, very crudely written letter from the person claiming to be the Green River Killer. Now, this letter had a lot of facts and a lot of details about these crimes that had not been reported in the news. And so they were pretty suspicious that this actually was from the Green River Killer. And they did have different investigators looking into the handwriting, the way things were spelled, but that too just led nowhere. Now, of course, this was a very highly publicized case in the area and also across the entire Pacific Northwest. And there was a lot of varied responses to this investigation into these crimes. First of all, there were several people that were extremely angry that taxpayer money was going into this investigation. A lot of people felt like, these are sex workers and they know when they get into this line of work that they are facing a lot of danger, that their lives are in danger. So why are you guys using taxpayer money to investigate these deaths and these missing women? Like it was almost like it was their fault. And then, of course, there were other people who were very supportive of the Green River Task Force and actually felt like they weren't doing enough. So they were kind of dealing with this combative public opinion, people not wanting them to investigate and people really wanting them to investigate and telling them, like I said, that they weren't investigating these crimes enough. But really, no expense was spared. And like I said, no rock was left unturned. I mean, they were doing everything in their power, spending multiple hours, overtime hours, weekend hours, middle of the night, whatever they needed to do to investigate these crimes. However, as the years passed, like into the mid 80s, late 80s, into the early 90s, the number of missing women started to go down, and also the amount of victims' remains started to get less and less. And at this same time that they were noticing this decline, Gary Ridgway met another woman that would eventually become his third wife. They met in 1985 at a single parents group and were married in 1987. And by all accounts, to the outside world and even to Judith, they were the perfect couple. They seemed so in love with each other. Judith had been really hurt by her previous marriage, and Gary was just the man of her dreams. She was absolutely head over heels in love with him, and he just treated her like a queen. They both had a lot of fun together. They were both single parents and would quite often see their children. They would go to swap meets together, flea markets together. They loved to go and pick out all kinds of knick-knacky stuff. And actually their house was absolutely filled to the brim with all the knick-knacky stuff that they would pick up at flea markets. Although they were madly in love, they didn't really spend a whole lot of time together because Judith had a job during the day and Gary was still painting at the Kenworth Truck Company on swing shift. So they really only spent a lot of time together on the weekends. And unbeknownst to Gary, and of course unbeknownst to Judith, ever since his arrest in 1982, the police, the Green River Task Force, was watching Gary and watching Gary hard. He was one of their main suspects since his arrest for soliciting sex work back in 1982. Now, he was picked up again in 1984, not for soliciting sex work, but they would just see him frequenting areas along the Pack Highway that were very known for sex work. And when they brought him down to the police station, they actually gave him 2 lie detector tests, and he passed both of them. So they couldn't do anything. They couldn't keep him. They couldn't tie him to anything, but they continued to watch him very frequently. They would follow him. They would kind of like stake out his house, but would never catch him doing anything untoward. But then in 1987, they did pick him up yet again. They were just still very suspicious of his behavior. And at that point, they did take DNA evidence from him. They took saliva, hair, and pubic hair, and then of course catalog that as evidence. So fast forward now to 2001. The Green River Killer has still not been caught. The Green River Task Force is still in effect. However, it's smaller and not as much money is going into the Green River Task Force. However, when all was said and done, $15 million had been spent on the Green River Killer investigation. And then in November of 2001, Gary Ridgway solicited another sex worker. However, she was an undercover cop. So he got arrested, of course, taken down to the police station. Basically, he was given a court date and then set free. He did tell his wife, Judith, that he'd been arrested, but of course the police had gotten it all wrong. It was mistaken identity, and she just totally believed him. Now, there were two detectives that were a part of the Green River Task Force that were convinced that Gary Ridgway was the Green River Killer, one in particular. And so on a hunch, he started to look back at the DNA evidence that was collected from the crime scene in 1982 when they found Marcia and Cynthia and Opal. And he also went and grabbed the DNA evidence that Gary Ridgway had given them in 1987. And, DNA evidence was just not really able to be analyzed very well throughout the 80s into the 90s. But now we're in 2001. So they could finally really analyze the DNA evidence. And lo and behold, the evidence that was taken from the crime scene in 1982, and also the DNA evidence that Gary Ridgway had given them in 1987, was a match. It was matched to 4 victims, Marcia Chapman, Cynthia Hines, Opal Mills, and Carol Christensen. And they were also able to gather some paint samples from Gary's work at one point in the 80s when they were investigating him. And those ended up matching paint specks that were found on 3 of the other victims, Wendy Caulfield, Deborah Bonner, and Deborah Estes. So in November of 2001, towards the end, I think it was November 30th of 2001, the Green River Task Force, 2 of the detectives from the Green River Task Force, went to Gary's place of employment and arrested him out in the parking lot. So now they want to build as strong of a case against Gary as they possibly can. So the search is on. They thoroughly search his current residence, and they go back and search like 2 or 3 of his former residences. Now, the interesting thing that Judith described when she was being interviewed by the police is that when she first moved in with Gary, that he had no carpet on the floor in the living area of his house. And he told her that he'd spilled a ton of red paint on the carpet, and that's why he had to get rid of it. And his neighbors actually saw him removing this carpet that was stained in red. And even though they searched high and low, they dusted everything. I mean, it was really hard in his current residence because, like I said, it was full of all those knick-knacky things from his flea market excursions. They were not able to find anything. Nothing. There was no DNA evidence, and there was nothing, no objects that they could tie to any of the victims. Now, they did, of course, interview his second wife. And when they found out that Gary was a sex addict and that also he liked to have sex out of doors, the detective said, "Hey, can you take us to the places where he would want you to have sex with him at?" And she did. And they found out that most of the places that Gary was having sex with his second wife out of doors were places where they had found the victims, where he had possibly murdered the victims, and also places where they had found victims' remains. And of course, his second wife had absolutely no clue that he was committing these crimes, and also that that's why he wanted to go and have sex with her out of doors, was like to relive his murdering memories or experiences. Now, initially, when they interviewed Judith, his third wife, his current wife, she was in an absolute, complete state of disbelief. She kept saying, "No, this can't be right. You have the wrong guy. There's just no way that Gary would do this." But as the detective started to, ask her more questions, and she started to admit that actually Gary was very obsessed with the Green River Killer investigation, that he actually had a scrapbook of newspaper articles talking about the investigation, it's like it slowly started to dawn on her that this was true. And she also started to like really think about the fact that they worked different shifts. And just like his second wife, she was noticing that there were a lot of times when Gary was supposed to be home and he wasn't home. Like she'd get home from work and it looked like he'd never been home. He was supposed to come home like in the early mornings and go to sleep. And it was obvious he'd never been home. So as hard as it was for Judith to accept the truth, I do believe, she did eventually accept the truth, but it took her a very long time to get there. And finally, on November 5th, 2003, Gary Ridgway pled guilty to 48 counts of aggravated murder. Now, the prosecuting attorney team, they really wanted to seek the death penalty for Gary, but they also wanted to find the rest of the victims' remains, and they wanted more information about any other victims that maybe they had missed throughout their investigation. So they did come up with a plea bargain. They basically said to Gary, if you will tell us, all the victims' names, everyone that you've murdered, and where their remains are, we'll give you life in prison. We will take the death penalty off the table. And on December 18th of 2003, he was convicted of 48 counts of aggravated murder and he was sentenced to 48 life sentences to run consecutively. And currently, he is housed at the Washington State Penitentiary. He has been moved around a few times, but currently he is residing at the Washington State Penitentiary. And, of course, he's been interviewed several times, and something that he will frequently say in his interviews is that he killed these women because he was so angry with them for making him feel lust, and that he felt like it was his job to rid the world of these evil sex workers, and that killing these women was like his career. And he's actually admitted to killing up to 71 victims, but I guess the issue is that they just weren't able to conclusively tie him to 71 victims. They were only able to conclusively prove that he murdered 48 women. Now, part of the issue that I was having with filming this video is that I want to talk about every single victim that Gary Ridgway murdered. And I didn't really know how to do that and not have this video be hours long. So I thought what I would do is pop up a picture, like there's like a collage picture that I found of all of the victims. And then I'm going to read to you their names and ages, because I think it's very important that each one of his victims has their name at least said in this video. Wendy Lee Caulfield, age 16. Giselle Ann Lavorne, age 17. Deborah Lynn Bonner, age 23. Marcia Faye Chapman, age 31. Cynthia Jean Hines, age 17. Opal Charmaine Mills, age 16. Terry Renee Milligan, age 16. Mary Bridget Meehan, age 18, and her 8-month-old fetus. Deborah Lorraine Estes, age 15. Linda Jane Rule, age 16. Denise Darcel Bush, age 23. Shonda Leah Summers, age 16. Shirley Marie Sherrill, age 18. Rebecca Marrero, age 20. Colleen Renee Brockman, age 15. Sandra Denise Major, age 20. Wendy Stevens, age 14. Alma Ann Smith, age 18. Dolores Laverne Williams, age 17. Gail Lynn Matthews, age 23. Andrea Marion Childers, age 19. Sandra K. Gabbert, age 17. Kimmy K. Pitzer, age 16. Marie M. Malvar, age 18. Carol Ann Christensen, age 21. Martina Teresa Otherly, age 18. Cheryl Lee Wims, age 18. Yvonne Shelley Antosh, age 19. Carrie Ann Royce, age 15. Constance Elizabeth Nayon, age 19. Kelly Marie Ware, age 22. Tina Marie Thompson, age 21. April Dawn Buttram, age 16. Debbie Mae Abernathy, age 26. Teresa Ann Winston, age 19. Maureen Sue Feeney, age 19. Mary Sue Bello, age 25. Pammy Annette Avent, age 15. Delise Louise Plager, age 22. Kimberly L. Nelson, age 21. Lisa Yates, age 19. Mary Exetta West, age 16. Cindy Ann Smith, age 17. Patricia Michelle Barzak, age 19. Roberta Joseph Hayes, age 21. Marta Reeves, age 36. Patricia Yellow Robe, age 38. Unidentified white female, age 14 to 18. Unidentified female, age 13 to 24. So I do want to give you guys my 2 cents here. And this was probably the hardest book I've ever read. And I honestly, I think part of the reason why this video is just coming up in November was because I was having such a hard time reading it. Because like I said, Ann Rule did such an incredible job detailing the lives of the victims in the book that I read. I mean, it just, you feel like you know these people. And to know that these women were so young, just a lot of them just starting off in their life, and to know that their lives had been snuffed out in such a horribly violent way, it was really sad and really, really hard to read. And, I just kept thinking about the fact that I am a mother of a daughter and how terrifying that would be if I didn't know where my daughter was and all these women were getting taken off the streets and their remains were being found and women were being murdered. I cannot imagine how horrible that must have been for their family members. And, my heart just really goes out to the victims' families. And I got also very angry as I was reading, when I was reading the accounts of the members of the public being so furious that all this money was going into the task force to help find the Green River Killer because they were just sex workers. I mean, that is a common theme of a lot of the books that I read, especially obviously if there's sex work involved, or, the victims are sex workers, that there's so many people that like blame the sex workers. And that just infuriates me. And so I just kind of kept taking breaks from reading the book because I was just so livid, because life is life. I mean, who cares what somebody chooses to do for their profession? They don't deserve to be killed, ever. And to come to such a violent death, and to lose all of these women over the course of, I believe it was, I think they think it was about 10 years that he was committing these crimes. The fact that he got away with it for so long, that was also a very hard thing for me to read about, because there were a few, more than two, but primarily two detectives, and one really detective really felt that Gary Ridgway was guilty of these crimes. They were following him. They were monitoring him. They would see him parked in his truck that was out in front of different hotels and taverns, and just, I guess, not have enough evidence to tie him to any of these crimes. I mean, obviously. The thing also that was really strange for me was that he would drive a truck with a canopy on the back, and also it had like primer paint spots all over the body of the truck. And that truck was seen so many times with the victims. The last time the victims were seen alive, they were seen getting into this type of truck. I mean, there were other vehicles reported too with these crimes, but I don't know. I just kept thinking, why couldn't they have stopped him way sooner? I mean, this went on for 20 years. 20 years this went on. I mean, I do believe, and the investigators believe, that from like 1985 onward, that it was pretty rare that he was murdering or kidnapping any victims. I think he did do it a few times, but not nearly like it had been in the early 80s. I mean, that was just do, like month after month after month, women were going missing. And then later on, obviously, their remains were being found. And the police the investigators really do believe that because he was truly in love with his third wife, that she really kind of pulled him away from behaving that way or committing those crimes. And so, a lot of the family members have actually thanked Judith for marrying Gary and pulling his attention away from committing those crimes. But I don't know. It's hard for me to believe that he ever really stopped doing it. I just think it just got less frequent is all. And of course, I realized that Gary had a horrible childhood, and a very strange, sexually abusive relationship with his mother. And I understand that can create a lot of warped thinking and a lot of horrible behavior. I mean, I've read that in so many of these books. But it's still just impossible for me to excuse his behavior. Absolutely impossible. And I am just so glad that he is off the streets now, and that he is serving the 48 consecutive life sentences. He should never get out of prison, and he won't ever get out of prison, ever. At first, I didn't know if he was incarcerated still or not, or I didn't even know if he was living. And I remember as I was getting close to the end of the book, I'm like, please give him the death penalty. Please give him the death penalty. And, I'm not really a supporter of the death penalty, but I was so angry with the loss of all these innocent lives that's really what was playing through my mind. And, I realize that they have to do plea bargaining type stuff in order to get more evidence and more names. And that's fine, and I'm glad that he did cooperate and give them more information. I still think he probably could have given them more information. I mean, if he's claiming that he's killed up to 71 women and he's only been charged with 48, you know what I mean? Like how much extra information did he really give them? I don't know. But yeah, this was a really tough case. And of course, I'd like to know what you guys think of this case. If you guys were familiar with this case, I think most people know about the Green River Killer. But again, I just want to say before I wrap this video up that my heart goes out to the victims' families. Absolutely goes out to these victims' families, and how tragic and awful it is that all of these beautiful, wonderful lights in this world were snuffed out. Just totally unacceptable. So I will try to have a true crime video up in the month of December, but with the holidays coming, I don't know that I'll be able to do that, but I'm going to try. And if not, I will hopefully have a true crime video up in the month of January. And I really do appreciate you guys taking time out of your lives to sit down and listen to these videos. I know they're on the longer side and just, really tough subject matter to get through, but it does really mean a lot to me. And I really do appreciate your time in watching these videos. And until I see you again, I hope you take very good care of yourself, be safe, and I will see you soon. Take care.